Maybe you're tired tonight. Maybe you open this because something feels heavy, something unnamed. There's this feeling that sits in your chest sometimes. A tightness, like you're being watched, even when no one's there. Like you're being measured against something you can't quite see. It's that sinking feeling, the one that comes without warning. The one that whispers you're not quite right, not quite enough, not quite doing it the way you should. And maybe you felt this for so long that you think it's just who you are. That sense of wrongness, that quiet certainty that somewhere, somehow, you failed to be what was expected. Even if you can't remember what that expectation was. It's okay if you don't have words for it yet. This isn't about finding the right words tonight. It's just about noticing, about sitting with what's here. You might notice something about yourself. The way you pause before speaking. How you check your words before they leave your mouth. Scanning them first. Making sure they're acceptable. You learn to do that somewhere. It's like there's an invisible editor inside you. One who reviews everything before it becomes real. Before it becomes visible. This editor knows rules you never agree to learn. You might notice how you shrink in certain spaces. Not physically, but internally. Like you're trying to take up less room. Trying to be smaller, quieter, less of a burden. That shrinking wasn't a choice you made consciously. It was a response. A survival skill that your body learned when being visible felt dangerous. When being yourself, fully yourself, came with consequences you couldn't name, but could definitely feel. You might notice how you apologize for things that aren't your fault. How you say sorry for existing in someone's path. For needing something. For taking up time. For having feelings that might inconvenience someone else. Those apologies come from somewhere deep. From a place that learned your presence needed justification. That your existence required permission. And maybe you've noticed the way you monitor yourself in relationships. How you track other people's moods, their energy, their subtle shifts in tone or body language. You became fluent in reading rooms, in sensing when you were too much or not enough. That vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was protection. Your nervous system learned to scan for danger in the form of disappointment, in the shape of someone's silence, in the texture of their withdrawal. You might notice the exhaustion that comes with this. The tiredness that isn't just physical. It's the weariness of constant self-monitoring, of living with an internal surveillance system that never takes a break. That fatigue makes sense. You've been working a second job your whole life. The job of managing how you're perceived, of controlling how much of you is acceptable to show, of protecting others from the fullness of who you are. There's a kind of household where emotions aren't welcome, not because anyone says so directly, but you feel it, in the silence that follows certain feelings, in the way conversations shift when someone starts to cry, in the subtle tightening of a parent's face when you're too loud, too excited, too much of whatever you are in that moment. And if you grew up in a home like that, you learned something. You learned that your feelings were an imposition, that your needs created problems, that who you were in your natural state was somehow inconvenient. You didn't learn this from conversation. You learned it from what wasn't said, from the absence of response, from the way your joy was met with exhaustion, or your sadness was met with irritation, or your anger was met with punishment that felt disproportionate to what you'd done. Maybe there were rules in your home that no one spoke aloud. Rules about what was okay to want, about what was acceptable to feel, about what parts of you were welcome at the dinner table and what parts needed to stay hidden in your room. Children are brilliant at learning invisible rules. They have to be, because their survival depends on staying connected to the people who care for them. So they learn to shape themselves around unspoken expectations. They learn to become what's needed, what's tolerable, what won't cause disruption. Maybe you had a parent who was stressed, not abusive, not cruel, just overwhelmed, tired, carrying their own weight. And you learned to be careful around that tiredness. You learned to make yourself small so you wouldn't add to their burden. You learned that your needs felt like weight on someone else's shoulders. That your presence, your requests, your very existence was something people had to tolerate rather than welcome. And that became shame. That became the story you told yourself about who you were. Or maybe there were comparisons. Subtle ones. A sibling who was easier, quieter, more compliant. A cousin who excelled at things you struggled with. And you learned that you were the difficult one. The one who required more patience, more management, more explanation. Those comparisons didn't have to be spoken to be felt. They lived in the air, in the way someone else's achievements were celebrated while yours were met with a nod, in the way your mistakes felt heavier, louder, more defining than anyone else's. Here's what happened. You absorbed someone else's limitations and made them your own. Not because you're weak or impressionable or broken, but because that's what children do. They internalize the emotional climate they grow up in. They take in the unspoken messages about who they're allowed to be. Your nervous system learned to interpret someone else's discomfort as evidence of your wrongness. When a parent was stressed and couldn't hold space for your feelings, you didn't think, they're overwhelmed. You thought, I'm too much. When someone withdrew because they couldn't handle closeness, you didn't think, they're scared. You thought, I'm unlovable. This is what internalization means. It means taking the shape of someone else's emotional capacity and believing that shape is the truth about you. It means carrying their limits as if they were your flaws. You weren't taught to do this. Your body learned it. Your nervous system encoded it. Because when you're small and dependent, you can't afford to believe the problem is with the people you need. So you locate the problem in yourself instead. And this became your baseline. This sense that you're fundamentally not quite right. That there's something about you that requires fixing, managing, apologizing for. That your natural state is somehow problematic. But here's the thing. That wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. What was true is that someone else couldn't hold all of you. What was true is that someone else's capacity was limited. Their ability to see you, to welcome you, to meet you fully, that was limited. And you were brilliant for learning how to survive inside those limits. The way you learned to shrink, to monitor, to apologize, to scan for danger in someone's tone or face, that was intelligence. That was your nervous system protecting you in the only way it knew how. You didn't become this way because you're damaged. You became this way because you were adapting, because you were reading the environment and learning what was safe. And what you learned was that safety meant making yourself smaller, quieter, less visible. That adaptation was wise. It helped you stay connected to people you needed. It helped you avoid conflict you weren't equipped to handle. It helped you survive in an environment that couldn't hold the fullness of who you were. But what was once protection became prison. The strategies that kept you safe as a child now keep you separate from yourself. The monitoring that protected you then now exhausts you. The smallness that helped you survive now feels like suffocation. And you can't just decide to stop, because these patterns live in your body, not your thoughts. They're encoded in your nervous system. They're automatic responses that happen before you're even aware you're responding. You don't have to change any of this tonight. You don't have to figure out how to be different or better or more free. You don't have to heal this or fix this or transcend this. Right now, you can just notice it. Notice the weight of carrying someone else's expectations. Notice how tired you are from trying to be acceptable. Notice how much energy it takes to constantly monitor whether you're too much or not enough. There's no urgency here, no timeline you need to meet, no version of yourself you should be arriving at. The fact that you're here, listening to this, recognizing even a sliver of this in yourself, that's already enough. If you feel tired hearing this, that's okay. If some part of you wants to close this and walk away, that's okay too. You don't have to keep listening. You don't have to push through. This will still be here if you need it later. Notice if your body reacts to this. Notice if there's tightness somewhere, or if there's softness, or if there's numbness. All of those responses are information. None of them are wrong. You're allowed to stay exactly as you are, with all the monitoring, all the shrinking, all the apologizing, all the hypervigilance. You're allowed to keep those strategies for as long as you need them. They were never the problem. They were your solution. They were how you stayed safe, how you maintained connection, how you survived in a world that couldn't hold all of you. And maybe one day you'll find that you need them less. Maybe one day you'll notice moments where you don't automatically shrink, where you don't check your words before speaking, where you don't apologize for taking up space. But that doesn't have to happen today. Today, you can just be tired. You can just be aware. You can just notice that this thing you've been carrying has a name, has a history, has a reason for being there. You can notice that shame isn't who you are. It's what you absorbed. It's what you took in when you were too young to know that someone else's inability to see you wasn't evidence of your invisibility. That someone else's inability to hold you wasn't proof of your unworthiness. You were whole before you learned to shrink. You were complete before you learned that your completeness was too much. You were enough before someone's limitations taught you that you weren't. And underneath all the monitoring, all the apologizing, all the careful self-management, that wholeness is still there. It didn't go anywhere. It just learned to hide. Because hiding felt safer than being seen and rejected, than being visible and unwelcome, than being yourself and discovering that yourself wasn't acceptable. You're not broken for developing these patterns. You're not weak for carrying them into adulthood. You're not failing by still feeling their weight. These patterns were survival, and you survived. Take a moment if you can. Just notice where you are right now. Notice the surface underneath you, the air around you, the sounds in your space, whatever they are. You don't have to do anything with this information. This isn't the beginning of a healing journey you're now obligated to embark on. This isn't a call to action. This isn't the start of some transformation you're supposed to complete. This is just recognition. Recognition that what you've been carrying has a story. That the shame you feel isn't an accurate assessment of who you are. That the way you learned to shrink was a response to something outside you, not evidence of something wrong inside you. Nothing is required from you. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not letting go, not moving on. You're allowed to sit with this for as long as you need. You're allowed to feel angry about it, or sad, or nothing at all. You're allowed to recognize that what happened to you was real. That the way you learned to measure yourself against invisible standards was a response to actual experiences. That the voice that tells you you're not enough isn't your voice. It's an echo, a recording that played so many times it started to sound like truth. And maybe that echo gets a little quieter now that you've named it. Maybe not. Maybe it stays just as loud. But at least now you know it's not the whole story. At least now you know there's a difference between what you learned to believe about yourself and what's actually true. This wasn't your fault. The way you internalized shame, the way you made someone else's limits into your own inadequacy, the way you learned to apologize for existing, none of that was your fault. You were responding to your environment the only way you knew how. You were surviving. You were protecting yourself. You were finding ways to stay connected to people you needed, even when those people couldn't fully see you. That was intelligence, not damage. That was adaptation, not brokenness. That was your nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. Keeping you safe, keeping you connected, keeping you alive. And if part of you is still monitoring right now, still checking whether you're understanding this correctly, still scanning for the right way to respond to what you're hearing, that's okay. That pattern is still here because it served you once. Because it helped you navigate spaces that felt unsafe. Because it protected you from something that felt threatening. You can thank it for that. You can acknowledge that this constant self-monitoring, this endless checking and measuring and adjusting, it came from somewhere wise, from somewhere that knew you needed protection. And maybe one day you'll discover you don't need it as much. Maybe one day you'll find yourself in a moment where you just exist, where you're not performing or managing or apologizing, where you're just there, fully there, without needing to shrink or hide or monitor. But that moment doesn't have to come today. Today, you can just rest in this knowing, this recognition that what you've been carrying isn't the truth about you. It's the weight of someone else's limitations that you learn to call your own. You can rest in knowing that shame is a language you learned, not a reality you were born into. That the expectations you internalized were never meant to define you. They were just the constraints of the space you grew up in. The boundaries of what was safe to be in that particular environment with those particular people. And those constraints don't have to be your constraints anymore. Not because you have to work to remove them, not because you have to fight them or overcome them or transcend them, but because you can begin to notice when they're active, when they're speaking, when they're shaping your choices. You can begin to notice the difference between what you actually think and feel and want, and what you learned was safe to think and feel and want. And in that noticing, there's space. Not a space you have to fill or fix or transform. Just a small gap between the automatic pattern and the conscious choice. Between the inherited belief and the lived reality. Between who you learn to be and who you actually are. There's no rush to widen that space. There's no timeline for unlearning what took years to encode. There's no deadline for releasing what your body learned to hold for survival. You can take all the time you need. You can move at the pace that feels tolerable. You can rest when you're tired. You can step back when it feels like too much. You can return to safety whenever you need to. And if tonight, all you take from this is a small sense that maybe, possibly, the way you feel about yourself isn't the whole truth, that's enough. That small opening is enough. That tiny shift in perspective is enough. That quiet recognition that shame is something you learned, not something you are, that's enough. You don't have to become someone new. You don't have to fix yourself, or heal yourself, or transform yourself. You just get to be here, with all your patterns, with all your protection, with all your learned ways of staying small. You get to be here knowing that underneath it all, you were never actually the problem. The problem was that you were in a space that couldn't hold you. The problem was that you were learning about yourself from people who couldn't see you clearly. The problem was that you had to shrink to fit inside someone else's capacity. But you don't have to keep shrinking. Not because you have to grow or expand or become bigger, but because you can start to notice that the size you actually are, the space you naturally take up when you're not monitoring or managing or apologizing, that size was never wrong. It was just inconvenient for someone else. And their inconvenience was never a referendum on your worth. Their limitations were never evidence of your excess. Their inability to hold you was never proof that you were too much. You were always just exactly enough. Exactly the right size. Exactly the right amount. Exactly as you needed to be. And if no one told you that, or if someone told you the opposite, or if you learned through silence and withdrawal and subtle disapproval that you weren't quite right, that doesn't change the truth. The truth is that you were whole before shame taught you to see yourself as fragments. And you're still whole now, even with all the ways you've learned to hide, even with all the monitoring and the apologizing and the careful self-management. Underneath all of that, the wholeness remains. You don't have to excavate it. You don't have to work to rediscover it. You just get to know it's there, waiting, patient, not going anywhere. Take your time. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to become, no version of yourself you're late in arriving at. You could just be here, exactly as you are, with all the weight you're carrying, with all the patterns you're still using, with all the ways you've learned to stay safe. And maybe, if you're very quiet, you can feel it. That small part of you that never believed the shame, that always knew, somewhere underneath the noise, that you were okay, that you were real, that you were worth seeing. It's still there. It's been there the whole time. And it's not going anywhere. It's just waiting for you to notice it again, to remember that it exists, to come back to it when you're ready. There's no rush. Take all the time you need.